Hello, I'm Vincent Ramirez, and welcome to In the Outside, the show where I talk with bold individuals who are navigating life in the public sphere out and proud. On this edition, I talk with Tina Strawn, a motivating fitness professional and mother of three who has found herself civically engaged and expressing her voice for change in the current political climate. She shares her journey from growing up in California to moving to Texas during her preteen years, where she has spent most of her life, to currently living in Atlanta, Georgia with her wife, Dorian. We discuss her religious upbringing and what it was like growing up being a preacher's daughter. She also talks about exploring her sexuality and questioning her religious beliefs later in life, and what eventually led her to finding a bridge from her religious background to finding self-acceptance as a gay woman. Tina shares what life is like living in the outside. And now, part one of my interview with Tina Strawn. All right, well, Tina, thank you very much for doing this. So what I'd like to do is just maybe get you to tell me a little bit about yourself. So where were you born and raised?
Sure. I was born in Statesville, North Carolina, and we only lived there for a year, and then we moved to California. And so California is where I consider that where I've spent my childhood, in the Silicon Valley, actually. So my father was a preacher, and in the denomination where he preached, the bishop, who's the head of the denomination, would tell all of the preachers where to go to pastor. And so my dad got an appointment to pastor a church in Pasadena, California. So when I was one, that's where we moved, and then we spent the next 10 years in California. And the majority of that time was in the Silicon Valley area. And so my sister was born in Pasadena. So we were Pasadena, Palo Alto, Sunnyvale, Mountain View, part of California. But we moved to Texas when I was 11. So
okay.
Yeah, I call myself Texan.
You do? So you consider yourself a Texan. That's interesting because so when I first met you, it was in Texas. You were teaching group or managing a department in group fitness, and I had no clue that you were originally from California, or that you were outside of being 1 year old, but had spent most of your childhood there. How interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of people in Texas, they knew I wasn't from Texas because I didn't sound like I was. I have not the typical Texas accent, so I always got the question, well, where are you from? And you're not from here. And so, even though I do, I lived in Texas for over 20 years, over 25 years, I want to say. So I consider Texas home, even though I spent my childhood in California.
Tell me, what was it like? Tell me a little bit more about yourself. Like, what were you like as a kid? So what was life like in California versus moving to Texas at that age?
Yeah, absolutely. So I lived a very sheltered life as a kid. Again, my dad was a preacher, and my mom was a teacher. So my life was there at school, which was a Christian private school in California, or it was at church. So between those two places, my life looked very controlled, and I didn't know much about life outside of the very pretty picture that was painted for me. And but I don't have anything negative to say as far as I was a happy kid. I was happy, and I thought everything in the world was great. And I really thought that everybody in the world was like me. And I thought everyone in the world had the same type of life experience. So I didn't really understand that there were poor people, except for, again, being in the Christian private school I was. What we knew about Africa is that that's very, very poor tribal people were. And that's kind of what I knew. Me and my sister, my mom, my dad, I enjoyed going to school. I enjoyed I just had a good life. I had a very happy home for the most part. Mm-hmm. And
And you mentioned that you said you have did you say an older or younger sister?
A younger sister. She's 2 years younger than me.
2 years. Okay. So, and no brothers or any other sisters
Nope.
besides the one. Okay. So when you Obviously we're growing up and kind of in a religious, essentially really kind of like a religious upbringing. Was it a very much of a, because your father's a preacher, you're at church every Sunday, or is it?
No, it was, yeah, we were definitely at church every Sunday. We were at church multiple times a week, definitely Wednesdays, definitely Sundays. And, Sunday school was a thing, vacation Bible school was a thing, and my world was revolved around church, really. Revolved around church. It revolved around us being a pastor's family, so me being a preacher's daughter. And, that church was a very, very big deal. My mother was what they called a Proverbs 31 woman, and that she, was a dutiful, submissive, obedient wife who took care of the kids in her home, and she was a great first lady. It's what they call the wives of the preachers, the first ladies. And I was your average PK.
So when y'all moved from, I guess from the California area to Texas, was your father still a preacher, or was that, was there?
Yes, he was. And same situation in that the bishop moved him from the church he was in California, which is, that church in California is where I have the most of my church memories as a kid. And, of course, I was in the same school from kindergarten through sixth grade, that Christian private school. So that really was life to me. So it was quite devastating when my parents told us we were moving to Texas, because I didn't want to leave my friends.
Yeah.
But
at that age, who does, right? That's tough.
Exactly. And I was 11 at the time when we had to move. So the bishop decided that my dad was going to pastor a church in Texas. And so up we rooted ourselves and off we went to Texas. And of course, as an adult later on, I would find out how political that decision was from the leadership of the church. But that's how we got to Texas. Is my dad was pastoring a church in Dallas, that's where we were sent.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you still involved with the church? I guess having that type of upbringing, are you still very active in that, or?
No,
okay.
Not at all. No.
Okay. So very different. At what age would you say that you kind of maybe, I don't want to say broke away from that, but maybe kind of started doing your own thing? Was it in your teenage years, later in life?
It was definitely later in life. So being raised in the church and being raised from a young age to have this more than awareness of God, but your whole existence. I understood my whole purpose in life for being on this planet was to glorify God, and that was it. So I accepted Christ into my heart as a very, very young age, and then spent the next 20 years or so trying to be the best Christian that I could be. And so even though we moved from California to Texas, my father was only with that denomination for another couple of years, and then he would break away from that denomination. We would then start to go to non-denominational churches in the Dallas area through my teenage years, and my faith would begin to change. But I was still very much, still very sheltered, still very committed to living this godly Christian life, which was more about all the things that I couldn't do than anything else. So, it was I spent a lot of time feeling guilty and trying to overcome my guilt by doing better, praying more, reading the Bible more, things like this. Yeah. So through my teenage years, while I wouldn't say I had any, I wouldn't say I got too wild and crazy, but, normal teenage stuff, got married at an early age and was still very much entrenched in the church and religion, pulled my then husband at the time into that with me, even though he had somewhat of a religious foundation as far as, he came from a family that went to church on Sundays. He wasn't as spiritual. I'll use the air quotes there. He wasn't as spiritual as me. He wasn't as spiritual as I thought he should be or as I wanted him to be. So I definitely played a role in forcing that on him. because I had been raised to believe and understand that the man is supposed to be the head of the household. And so I tried to help shape and mold him into that.
Okay.
Because I wanted to be the submissive wife. That's what I thought was my role and responsibility. So through my marriage, my early part of my marriage, I was driving the family, him and the kids, to church every Sunday and making sure we were involved in all of the Bible studies and the Sunday schools and, going to women's groups and he going to his men's groups and prayer breakfasts and that whole deal. So I wanted to create a home that looked very much like the home that I was raised in, where church was the central force. And I think sometimes my then husband went along with it as much as he could, but that was how I was through young adulthood.
Yeah.
But of course, very controlled and manipulated by what I felt my role was as a woman, which really was not anything more than being a godly wife, being a helpmeet to my husband, and raising my kids. And so I was doing that and living that type of life until my late 20s. And really, I started to break away from the church after my mom passed away of cancer. She had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and she passed away in 2005. And that's when I kind of just started the slow disconnect, which would gradually lead me to leaving the church completely, which would gradually lead me to really finding out who I was and almost recreating myself. So the person that I am today is the complete opposite from the person that I was in my early 20s.
Outside of, some things that we've kind of already talked about and what I know of you, it is a very drastic difference. I know you mentioned in the beginning that you were, when we talked offline, that you were remarried and your wife that you live with in Atlanta now. I want to ask you a little more about that.
Okay.
But I'm really intrigued on the kind of the journey finding yourself. Obviously, it sounds like in your early part of your life, or at least in that half of it, religion obviously played a very central force in it. And did you find at any point kind of through the process, did you ever see yourself at that point leaving the church, or ever kind of just stepping away from kind of what those core values that you were being taught in the church, at some point in your life? Or were you very just that committed at that point?
I was completely committed. I was actually very active in the church. All of the ministries that I was involved in were very important to me, and I was completely committed. I remember vaguely that when I was 19, I volunteered at a pregnancy center that was basically created to divert women from getting an abortion. So it was this ultra uber pro-life place where we would, the first word that comes to mind is lure, even though there's probably a better way. We would lure women into the pregnancy center with a free pregnancy test. So women who were in difficult situations, who were afraid they were pregnant, and we would try to interrupt their process between us and the abortion clinic. So I mention that just because my whole life was at the time dedicated to what I thought was God, but really what it was dedicated to was the evangelical, conservative, religious right agenda of being pro-life, so anti-abortion, anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ, and basically anti-anything that wasn't Christian, wasn't fundamental Christian. So, I was raised to believe that Catholics were cultish, and my wife was raised also the daughter of a preacher, and her father still is a pastor actually in the Seventh-day Adventist church.
Okay. Wow.
I was raised that Seventh-day Adventists were cults. So basically everything was a cult if it wasn't true, if it wasn't evangelical Christianity.
Wow. That's that extra layer of intensity when it comes to, I mean, obviously you're now you now have a wife as a partner, and was that, I mean, at any point during that time period were you either, like kind of questioning yourself, or was it things that you kind of felt like, oh, like this is just kind of conflicting with maybe some things that you were feeling? Do you feel that maybe at a certain point there was some suppression, or, how was that experience for you in that environment?
So what I remember now is that my very first sexual experience, I remember my first physical experience, I was very, very young, and it was with a girl, a young girl who was my age, and we were playing around, as I'm sure kids were. But I remember that almost as one of my most vivid memories from childhood, which is odd. Moving on from that, I definitely had feelings at times, but nothing that caused me to feel that I am anything other than supposed to be with a man. I like to describe it as I was conditioned to grow up and marry a man, and there were no other options, no other alternatives. And I honestly don't think I even knew or met or saw a gay person until I was maybe in high school.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't anything that I was exposed to, and I just didn't even know that was a thing. So while I had feelings at times, it was definitely something that I did not allow myself to, I just didn't allow myself to think too much about, put too much stock into, until I was older. I was adult and I was married. And I actually started having a lot of vivid dreams about women. But during my marriage, I was still very, very religious, very much caught up in church and knowing how evil and wrong and sinful it was for me to have these dreams. So I went down this whole path of really trying to explore what happens to my soul when I sin in my dreams. Like it was, I remember I would have girlfriends of mine. I told a couple of my very close girlfriends at the time that I was having these evil, sinful dreams about women, and we would fast and pray over my dream life, and that, we were convinced that I was being tormented by a demon. So it was something that I dealt with when I was married. It's not something that I ever shared with my husband. It was just something that I had this internal struggle with. Yeah. To the point that when my husband and I got divorced, I knew that I wanted to take time to explore whatever that was going on with me before getting into another relationship. And so that's kind of how it started.
I don't know if you mentioned this actually. Did you have kids as well? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I do.
And I guess during that time period of the marriage and everything, and you said that you never talked to your, I guess now your ex at that point, your husband at that point, kind of about some of the things that you're feeling. But you mentioned you opened up to some close friends about it. These were friends that were they involved with the religion as well?
Absolutely. Okay. I didn't have any friends who weren't. Okay. Those are the only people that I knew.
Okay. All right. So that was kind of your circle of kind of that world that you were living in with so all your friends and the people that you're associated with were part of that same religion. Right. How long? I guess the question would be, how long have you been out?
I would say I'm living my life. I've been out 9 to 10 years.
Okay. 9 to 10 years. Okay. And at this point in your life, you've divorced. You're recognizing that there's obviously a world outside of the religion that you're in. How was that process and journey for you when you were kind of brought up and raised in a certain way, religion and this factor of life? Those things I think after a while get just ingrained in you, right? and they become part of just the things that make you up from a day-to-day basis.
Yes, for sure.
After your divorce, and would you say that it was something that took time to kind of reconcile, I guess maybe was the word I'm looking for?
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, absolutely. So I really think that I started this journey of questioning everything after my mom passed. My mom was my best friend. We were very close.
Right.
But again, she was a very religious woman. So very, very proper. Practically, she was, I call her my Mary Poppins, in that she was practically perfect in every way. She never smoked, never drank, never said bad words, and she just wanted to be the ultimate wife and mother. That's truly who she was, and that's what I remember of her. And so when she died, that, you know, when you lose a parent, especially if you were very close to that parent, for me, losing not only my best friend, but my first friend, and really the woman who was the foundation to who I was, that kind of began a slow unraveling. So my grip on the church and my grip on religion started to loosen just enough to where the doubts that I had, even though I didn't have very many, any little doubt just started to, a little seed started to grow there. And then would begin to, you know, the more that I leaned into those doubts and started to ask more questions, those doubts grew. And I eventually, over the next several years, would go through the process of realizing that this is not who I really am. And not just, it's not who I am. I don't believe that there is this heaven. I don't believe there is this hell. I don't believe that only certain people go there, that was revolutionary for me, because I had been raised to believe this very rigid path of salvation to heaven. And so it's very much like you said, as far as the reconciling with my faith. I'll even say that really me stepping away from the church and from that spiritual foundation wasn't even about my sexuality. It started with my questioning about hell.
Yeah.
That's really where it began. I just could not process that people were sent to this literal fiery lake of fire and brimstone, and that was a real thing, right? So then, as I started to expand in my experiences, expand the people that I allowed myself to spend time around, because again, like I mentioned, my world began as a child very sheltered and controlled with people who also believed the same way that we did, whether it was church or the Christian private school. And then I just grew up and got married, and also, again, you know, forced my family, my then husband and my kids, to be in church every single moment that we could be.
Right.
So when I started to expand just my knowledge of other people and other belief systems, and just learning more than just the Bible, reading more than just the Bible, that's when I began to let go of my tight grip on religion. And from my sexuality perspective, there's a book that I read. It was given to me by two friends that actually had so much to do with helping me begin to accept and embrace who I am as a queer woman. And Sylvia and Donna, they gave me a book, and the book is called Stranger at the Gate by Mel White. I want to say that Mel White was one of the founding members of Cathedral of Hope in Dallas, Texas, which at the time was, and perhaps even still now, one of the largest gay churches in the world. But reading that, he was a big part of the evangelical movement, Christian movement in the 70s and the 80s, and such a big part that he was a speechwriter for many of the for the Billy Grahams and the Pat Robertson. So he was just very, very connected in that circuit, and just wanted to live his life as a good Christian man. He got married to his wife. They had kids, knowing the entire time in his heart that he was a gay man.
Okay.
But for years and years and years, praying against it and fighting against it, and just trying to be a good Christian and hope that God would accept him until he finally got to the point where he, acknowledged who he was and acknowledged that this is who God made him to be, and there was nothing wrong with it. And so, anyway, that book was the one of the beginning bridges for me from my religious background to accepting who I was as a gay woman.
Stay tuned for part 2 of my interview with Tina Strawn, and don't forget to subscribe to In the Outside podcast and share it with all of your friends and leave reviews.
I like to joke that I was the last person to know what is this thing that I have with women. Let me just figure this out, and I'll start dating women and see what that's all about. That first year is when I would gradually start to come out in my personal and professional relationships. Each time I did, and every time I would voice something about me liking a woman or being with a woman, I would feel that much stronger, that much more confident, and just, I'd feel brave, and I'd have this relief.